The deal between Poland and Sweden on submarines is really important, but it's also part of a wider effort within the Baltic, particularly between the Swedes and the Poles, to establish, and they're calling it the Baltic Sea Pact. And it's very much a case of transferring high-grade intelligence and also technology from the Swedes to the Poles in order to build up an aspect of the Polish military which is not necessarily as high-tech and as high-proof as other parts as well. So what they're going to do, they're going to build some new submarines. It's going to take a few years until about 2038 before they get them. But in the meantime, the Swedish Navy is going to help the Polish Navy to acquire the techniques and the tactics in order to use these submarines. The submarines themselves are optimised for the Baltic, and it's a very specialist area. It's a large area of seawater. Parts of it are very shallow, and it's very different, therefore, from the kind of submarine warfare areas that we in the UK are used to. Our Navy and our submarines are really optimised for operating in deep waters, the Atlantic or the Pacific, whereas the Baltic is slightly different, and the Swedes have great experience of operating in those areas. And what they're going to be able to do is pass on that experience and that technology to the Poles. The recognition, I think, that that area, the Baltic, was not properly defended has taken a couple of years to come through. But it's important to note that Sweden and Finland in 2023, so a year after the Russian aggression in Ukraine, joined NATO. Now, both of these countries are long-term neutral countries, have been a key part of their way of thinking about warfare, that they were neutral and only fight in the case of direct aggression. But they joined NATO, and I think since then, there's been a significant effort across a number of areas to improve the coordination and the technological ability of the nations in that area. So, for example, there is also something called the Nordic-Baltic Pact, which is the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries all working together. And the UK is also the leader of something called the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is very much focused on Northwest Europe, the Baltic, but also areas like Svalbard to the north of Norway, and then out into the Atlantic Bastion. So a real emphasis on a part of Europe which perhaps had been neglected before. Putin will be worried. I mean, Putin has always had a view, particularly the Baltics, that essentially that these are lost territories of the great Soviet Empire. In fact, he's actually on the record as saying that while he could just about recognise them as independent countries, they should have, on his terms, are limited sovereignty. In other words, he should be able to do what he wants in there. All the Baltic countries, well, have significant Russian minority speakers. And in the past, the Russian propaganda, disinformation effort, and indeed the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service have tried to spread rumours about mistreatment of Russian minority populations in those areas. So he's very much focused on those, and it's not impossible he could consider trying to take them over as well. So the other thing that's happened, which I think is of real significant interest, is that Latvia and Ukraine have now signed a deal for Latvia to produce its own drones. And this is part of a wider effort by Ukraine to disperse its drone production, because clearly any drone factories inside Ukraine themselves might be regarded as legitimate targets by the Russians. So Ukraine now has deals with 5 countries, including places like Denmark, to produce drones. This gives them some safety in terms of their production, so some of their production is safe, but also, of course, helps the defence of those countries which are hosting these new factories. And the latest deal, which is a deal between Latvia and Ukraine, is very much focused on that. The Latvians themselves have got one of the highest minority Russian populations, and they're very conscious of their relative weakness against an aggressive Russia. They're talking about establishing a kind of drone line along their border with Russia. They're very clear about this. One of the reasons they want to do this is to stop Russian drones, but also then to mean that they don't have to keep deploying Air Force assets, which are mostly NATO Air Force assets, to try and shoot down drones, which we've learned from various campaigns, both in Ukraine but also in the Middle East recently, is a very expensive way to knock down a $60,000 drone with a £6 million missile. It's not a great way to do it, and it's not efficient militarily from that reason. But the Latvians, I guess, are not beyond provoking Russia, and they intend to build this factory right on the Russian border itself, so as close to the Russia as they can. And no doubt Putin and his cronies will look at this with a significant amount of disfavour. I think what the Ukrainians will be able to do is very clever. The more they can actually disperse their production away from Ukraine itself, it means the more security, resilience, if you like, that they have in terms of making sure they've got the drone production they need. And they need a lot of drones. The figures they've got are some 4 million drones per annum that they're producing, and they're firing them off at rates of literally hundreds per day at Russia. And the sophistication and the range of these drones is now becoming increasingly large. It's no longer just first-person view battlefield tactical drones. We've also got drones now that can reach from Kyiv out to 1,500, even 2,000 kilometers from Kyiv to hit some strategic targets well into Russia's strategic depth. So they need more drone production over a wider range of equipment at a higher quality, all of which, of course, are vulnerable to Russian attack. So dispersing them, having them produced in other countries makes perfect sense. Putin will react extremely angrily to what's going on. We know from a previous experience that he attacks some of these dispersed sites. He's attacked warehouses in Poland. He's also attacked a warehouse in UK, in East London, which was storing equipment that was going across to Ukraine itself. So he will react angrily to this. And it's a balance, but I think the balance at the moment is that Putin is an aggressor. There's no question about that. And so Latvia, like other countries, have every right to defend themselves. But a reaction should be expected. We've also got the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the so-called SVR, spreading rumours that, for example, the Ukrainians are using both the Baltic airspace or indeed actually launching missiles, cruise missiles from Baltic territory. So they're kind of creating this information preparation for an aggressive attack in the future, if that's what they want to try and do. Certainly they're trying to convince the Russian people that the Baltics, through their launchpad nature for drone attacks to Russia, are a threat. They're not. There is actually no evidence whatsoever that these items are either transiting through Latvia or being fired from Latvia. But that doesn't stop Putin and the SVR from spreading these rumours. Overall, at the moment, in terms of the campaign, Russia is on the back foot. This may seem strange given the size and scale of Russian forces, but they're definitely on the back foot. Tactically, in the immediate frontline area, there's now effectively what they call a zone of death, some 30 or 40 kilometres wide, in which it's very difficult to manoeuvre at all. Very hard for the Russians to be able to concentrate, and therefore very hard for them to be able to conduct any kind of serious attack. Of course, it's also the same for the Ukrainians. It's hard for them to do so. But what the Ukrainians have been able to do is now to reach out with their extensive range of missiles and drones and hit targets in the operational depth. We've seen it particularly in the Crimea, where the Crimean logistics, which is a big logistics hub for the Russians, have been very badly affected. So that's going on inside the Crimea as well. But other targets further afield, including places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, have brought home, perhaps for the first time, to the Russian population, the consequences of their action. You know, some of the targets in both Moscow and St. Petersburg area have been these oil refineries. And every time you hit an oil refinery, not only do you affect Russia's economy, but they send this huge pole of smoke up into the air, visible for literally miles around, bringing home to the Russian people what's going on from there. So overall, Russia is definitely on the back foot at the moment. Whether that will bring Putin to the negotiating table, which of course is the point of it as far as President Zelensky is concerned, is still doubtful. This is a man who's very stubborn and very convinced that he needs to deliver Russia as a kind of great empire, as he saw it was in the Soviet Union times. But on the battlefield, both tactically, operationally, and even strategically, Ukraine is currently winning. It's probably worth talking a little bit about Ukraine and where Ukraine is at the moment. Undoubtedly, President Zelensky is feeling very confident. We saw, for example, on May the 9th, he rather sarcastically gave permission for the Kremlin to hold its traditional May Day parade, a parade which he otherwise had threatened to disrupt. And what did happen was that the parade took place, but without any of the usual tanks and missiles that Putin was wont to display from there. But the confidence can also lead him astray. Recently, there's been a very serious spat with Poland themselves, when President Zelensky nominated a particular unit as heroes of the UPA. Now, the UPA was the Ukrainian insurgent army from World War II, who fought quite happily both Russians and Germans from time to time. But most difficult for Poland, they're also responsible for the murders, really brutal murders, of some 100,000 Poles themselves. And this went down extremely badly with the Poles. President Zelensky was stripped of his honours, and it's created a serious spat. This is rather foolish, because come the day when there is some kind of peace, some kind of ceasefire, the geography isn't going to change, and Poland and Ukraine will need to be able to work together from there. So there's an element whereby this overconfidence, while it's very good to see, could overplay the hand of Ukraine. And I think as people look forward, even just in the very slightest way, to a kind of ceasefire and a peace for the future, Ukraine in particular will have to think quite hard about how it handles relations with its neighbours. At the moment, they're all determined. They're all determined to stop Putin and everything goes there. But in peacetime, different considerations, different factors come to play. And I think that's something which they'll need to look forward for the future.